Hi, welcome to Ideology. And Drew, I have to ask right off the bat, are you letting the stash thicken a little bit?
You know, I just alternatively trim my beard, and I can't really ever shave it because of family restrictions. So this is about as far as I can go.
Spousal restrictions or?
Really, whole family at this point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, welcome.
Yours is looking nice and long.
Yeah, thanks. I'm actually, it stuck out to me because I'm thinking about shaving the beard this weekend, but leaving the stash just for something new.
I encourage that.
Okay, well, we'll see.
I should be the one who decides, I think.
And for our listeners, if you want to see it, you have to go to YouTube at Ideology PC.
So are you promising a mustache next week?
I'm promising a mustache.
Does Steph know about this?
Well, okay. I am promising that I will shave it into a mustache this weekend. Whether it makes it to the recording 5 days later is yet to be seen.
So we'll know a lot about how conversations went down in your house based on how you appear on our next recording.
Yes, you will know.
Sorry, Steph.
So there's no easy segue from that to eschatology, but we are in week 2 of eschatology. So if you are just now tuning into Ideology, then I would recommend going back 1 week at least and listening to last week as we teed up kind of a high-level look at a study of the end times. And this week we're going to look specifically at Matthew 24 and 25, and not just Matthew 24 in isolation, because those really are coupled together for reasons that will become apparent as we go through the content today. And the next week, we are going to attempt to interpret the book of Revelation in 40 minutes. So we'll see how that goes.
Easy.
Easy. But last week, you went over some historical viewpoints on how to think about the end times from all of the millennial, pre-, and post-millennial perspectives and some of the sub-themes that emerge in those discussions. But today, why don't you take us into Matthew 24, a difficult passage to untangle.
Yeah, we're going to look at both Matthew 24 and Matthew 25. I believe that these are important eschatological passages, but maybe not for why we would naturally think. Probably many of us would be tempted to look at the first 31 verses of Matthew 24 as primary eschatological teaching. And I'm actually arguing that the primary teaching that we need to be paying attention to as it relates to the end things is what comes after that. And it's a series of 5 parables that Jesus tells, starting in Matthew 24, verse 32, through the remainder of Matthew chapter 25. Now, to get to those parables, I do want to just take a moment and just take maybe some of even what we shared last week and show how we can interpret those first 31 verses. I am not saying that those first 31 verses are also not eschatological in nature. I think it's maybe debatable about exactly how they apply. I personally would argue that there is relevance for the church today. Those are not merely historical verses. At the very least, I think it's clear that they represent central themes of what God is doing during the age of the church in those verses. But I think at the same time, I think there's a good case to be made that the primary context is initially the fall of the temple at Jerusalem. So taking those first 31 verses and looking at some of the details of, praying your flight doesn't happen in the winter, is that referring to a final period of tribulation, or is that referring to the plight of Christian believers in Jerusalem when it's surrounded by Rome? That's a more complex question. But the good news for us is regardless of exactly how to interpret the first 31 verses, I think it's crystal clear what Jesus is saying to the church as far as how we are supposed to live in the light of the Lord's coming. And that's what I want to put the primary attention on, is we could debate the different millennial frameworks or preterist or futurist or whatever. We could debate that. But then actually I think if we can start with the parables or end up at the parables, really regardless of where your eschatology falls, I think the application for the Christian is actually the same. Let me start. I always, whenever I do any kind of exegesis, I like to know what's the point of the book, and where that's really helpful, and we've gone through this before, but where that's helpful is when in doubt, it helps me to see maybe what the author intends in a certain passage, because it typically ties into their main point. Now, I'd say for Matthew, that the central theme is that Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promise and purpose to Israel, and for the sake of God's purposes in all the nations of the earth, or for all of humanity. So it starts off, and his genealogy is talking about how Jesus, is the son of Abraham, the son of David, kind of the full purpose of God in the history of Israel. But it culminates with the disciples being out as a witness to all the nations. At the beginning of Matthew, Jesus is God with us. At the end of the Great Commission, Jesus is saying to his church, I will be with you always to the end of the age. And so you just see all these parallels throughout Matthew's gospel that's demonstrating continuity with God's purpose and fulfillment of God's purpose. God has not abandoned his people. However, what it's also saying is that in the person of Jesus, God become man, we now see the fullness of God's purpose, and that even extends unto the nations of the earth. And so that's the background theme in Matthew's gospel, and I think helpful for interpreting 24 and 25.
Yeah, one little sub-thought there in terms of the purpose of Matthew's gospel, not only to all nations, but to all people, meaning, if you think of Matthew, and I'm pulling this from Marty Solomon in the Bema Discipleship Podcast, but think of Matthew as an outsider among his own people and how Jesus called him to himself. And you mentioned the genealogies in Matthew 1 and how Matthew seems to go out of his way to highlight these kind of questionable chapters in the genealogy with whether it's Tamar or Rahab or blanking on on Bathsheba, the line of David through Bathsheba, and that these were people of ill repute, certainly in that patriarchal society, women to be named and former prostitutes. And then with that setup, then going throughout the book of Matthew, just noticing how many outsiders Matthew highlights. So not just the extent of the reach to all nations, but within those nations, Jesus calling the outsider to be an insider. And that theme will even show up here in Matthew 25.
You can even compare the genealogies of Matthew and Luke, I think are instructive, because Luke starts with Adam, Matthew starts with Abraham. And they're both saying the same thing. They're both describing how in Jesus, Jew and Gentile are joined together by the Spirit to form the church and God's ultimate purpose for humanity. So there's no incongruency in the message, but Luke is putting the accent on the universal call of Jesus to all nations. Matthew is putting the accent on Jesus as the fulfillment of Israel for the sake of the nations. They're both ending with all the nations, but Matthew is emphasizing God's purpose in Israel, and I love how you draw that in, even the unlikely people in Israel's story, or those we might tend to discount in Israel's story. So they have these little accent pieces throughout both of them, but it's helpful in reading, because then as you go back through and read these Gospels, you can see, oh yeah, that's why maybe Matthew might spend more time on that. And that's where that pulls us into chapter 24. I want to read the first 3 verses because I think it's always important when you exegete, what's the context, what's prompting the dialogue, like what's taking place in this story, rather than jumping into all of these different signs that occur in the heaven. We have to know where to fit them. So Matthew chapter 24, verse 1, Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things, he asked. Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on one another. Every one will be thrown down. And as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So there's several.
Is that NIV?
Yeah, that's out of the NIV. Several key ideas here. First, if you think of the context of what I just said about Matthew, the concern for the role of the temple is a lot more prominent in Matthew because Jesus is the fulfillment of God's purposes for Israel. So there's going to be a lot of dialogue about the role of the temple. Of course, the temple's in the other Gospels, but I think that might be why there's such an intensity in Matthew 24 and 25, is because if you are a Jewish Christian, that has to be a significant question for you. Where does Jesus fit in our worship of God and our understanding of God's presence with us? And again, a theme in Matthew, God with us. The temple is where God has historically been with us. So you can see the disciples, they're at the temple, and at that time, my best understanding is the disciples at this point still understood Jesus predominantly as a political figure who was going to, in some way, overthrow Roman and Gentile rule and probably also corrupted, temple authorities like the Sadducees, and he's going to establish a renewed Jewish kingdom centered at Jerusalem where temple worship would no longer be under this corrupt temple authority, but would now be restored back to the priesthood, and that Israel would be governed by a godly king in the lineage of David. So as best I can tell, up and until the crucifixion and even after the crucifixion, the disciples, that was their understanding of the purposes of Jesus. So you can imagine they're at the temple, they're looking at the temple, they're talking about the temple. In their mind, the temple isn't the issue. They just need a change in leadership. So you can imagine how shocking Jesus' words are. Actually, this beautiful temple that you're looking at is going to be completely leveled and razed to the ground. Not one stone is going to be left on another. Now, for us, that's historical. Like we that doesn't shock us in the same way, but we can maybe think of some really prominent central building or place. If somebody told you that in the next 30 years, that was going to be completely wiped off the map, you would do exactly what the disciples did. Hey, Jesus, tell me more about that. Like, I want to know what you just said when you said that. So this is all very understandable. And the immediate context here, and I think this is important, is when are these things going to happen is their first question. They're referring to what Jesus said was going to happen to the temple. So right out the gate, we see this is a very particular question related to the temple. But they follow up, and what will be the sign of your coming? Now, your coming, that phrase in Greek is parousia, or parousia. And parousia is a technical term in Christian theology that specifically refers to the second coming of Jesus. It's actually not used that frequently in Scripture, and 4 of the uses are in Matthew 24. And so, maybe a biblical scholar could say that we're reading later theological development into the text, but because I'm allowing historic Christian theology to interpret the text, I'm going to accept that as a second coming reference. Interestingly, if you're to look this up in, a Greek concordance, Advent is one of the words. So back to our Christmas or our Advent series. So they're asking, tell us, like, what's going to happen? And then what are the signs of the end of the age? Now, we could theoretically try to say those are all 3 one and the same, but they aren't. So the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. That's a historical event that happened, that did happen within a generation of Jesus' words. The second coming has not yet happened. And Jesus is explicitly clear later in this passage. This is one of the other 4 references of parousia, is that the second coming, you're going to know when it happens. So when I come, it's going to be like the lightning in the sky. You're not going to be able to miss it. And so the events around the temple have happened. The second coming has not happened. And then I think it's debatable, what does it mean that the age has ended? Is that referring to all of human history? Or is that referring to the age of the world order as it was, where the temple was the center of worship in Jerusalem, and the end of that age is replaced by the age of the church, or some paradigm like that? That's a debatable interpretation. So that's complex. Like, any way you slice it, that is complex. I think if you are premillennial or amillennial, postmillennial, if you're a preterist or a futurist, unless somebody wants to try to make the argument that Christ has already returned, which I think is a very bad argument, it's difficult to get around that. I think I've heard some premillennialists try to say that the temple is going to be rebuilt and destroyed again. That to me feels like a forced reading of a very clear understanding of the text that was actually, again, a great testimony to prophecy that bore out in historical events. So I think we have to accept this as the reference to the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem and also a reference to the second coming of Christ. But those 2 things are not one and the same.
And to pull this into maybe modern relevancy, I think it's endearing to note that the disciples were concerned with the same things that we tend to be concerned with. And I know we'll turn a corner and talk more about that here in a moment. But this was the center of their world, and their world was all that they knew. It was what was right in front of them. And so to your point, Drew, that the temple was so central to Jewish worship and Jewish life and Jewish community and really the whole organization of the Jewish society. For Jesus to insinuate that was going to be torn down, obviously, and we have hindsight, but how disturbing a thought. And so they want to know, what are going to be the signs? When is this going to happen? And I think just as we look at even modern events in the Middle East, the same unease when our worlds are disrupted, probably not in the same way. It's not a one-to-one, but when our comfort, security, when what is known is disrupted, it can create the same list of questions. And so I think God has tremendous patience with that. But this is an instructive passage to see how Jesus pivots from the disciples' initial reaction to this statement.
It's great reflection and relevance for us. So the first 10 verses after that intro, 4 to 14, I'm not going to read them all. I think these could be understood as signs of the age. And really, if you were a premillennial or an amillennial, like whether or not you reference this, or really, I guess maybe another way of saying it, you could be more preterist or futurist. Any way you slice it, Jesus is saying these are signs of the age. These are things that are going to happen. Wars, rumors of wars, famine, and on down. And the gospel is going to be preached as a testimony to all the nations. Then the end will come. End here in English is telos in Greek, so it's also like a fulfillment. And so what we see is that in this age, what we find is there are wars, famines, the trials of human life. And as we look at Revelation, we're going to see all the same things. These are the things that mark this age. And then there is this witness of the gospel that simultaneously, alongside the trials of this age, is the advance of the gospel. And I think we could categorize this as what this time in history, however long it is characterized by. Now, there's a reference here of birth pains, and so you could stretch that, and I think it would be fine to do so, though, we get into, I think for me, in general, the first 31 verses of Matthew 24, I'm cautious on too strong of eschatology, but you could, I think, make a fair argument that there's an intensity that could happen with these things in history. I think you see something similar in the book of Revelation is cycles of these trials that humanity faces, but they increase maybe in severity with time. But even that, I'm going to hold that open. I'm not going to say that as the clear eschatological teaching, but I think it could be in there. And you see God's purpose of the gospel being preached to the nations, all found in those first 10 verses. However, once you get to verse 15, things get more specific. So when you see standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation, that's a phrase referencing Old Testament, and for a Jewish person, they would have understood that to the destruction of the temple earlier, where at that time a pagan sacrifice was offered on the altar. And so it's this concept of pagans have invaded the holy place, which has happened multiple times in Israel's history. They have worshipped their idols in the holy place. They have destroyed the temple. And so what's being prophesied here is what actually happened with Titus and the fall of Jerusalem, where Roman legions broke into the temple and razed it to the ground and offered sacrifices. So, I have seen in certain kind of pop culture end times book, people talking and speculating about what that may be. I would say what this is referencing to is actually a historical event. Could it have a future thing too? Maybe. But I think what's happening here is Jesus is reminding them, when this happens, when you see pagans invading the holy place, then flee. And there's actually research that, Christians heeded his advice. Rather than staying and fighting when Rome had surrounded Jerusalem, instead of adopting this nationalistic, we're going to fight for the kingdom of God and fight off the Romans, Christians actually left the city. And of course, many died, but they heeded those words largely. They didn't take up the cause that in this moment, our job is to fight off the Romans. And then you see all these different things of the distress, even those not go back down to their house. It's like a siege is coming, so they have to get out of the city very quickly before the siege sets in, which is what happened in 70 AD, et cetera, et cetera. Where this gets complicated, so you can kind of read starting in Matthew 15 right up until, I would say about verse 29. That's where this gets complex. I would say 15 to 28, pretty straightforward. But starting in verse 29, you have, after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. All the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and glory. He will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Okay, so now it's complex again. You read those, and it certainly indicates the second coming of Christ. As I mentioned last week, I don't want to restate it. I do think it's worth reminding us that this whole idea about the sun being darkened, the stars falling from the sky, that is language from Isaiah 13:10, Isaiah 34:4. In Isaiah, this is referencing to God casting down kingdoms. So it's not a reference to the second coming or the end of history. It's a reference to God's judgment over the pagan nations.
Or some literal celestial event where stars literally fall from the sky, though it could be that.
It could be that, and that could be the judgment at the end of time. I think, though, if we allow the Old Testament to interpret the New, it's probably better understood as a reference to God casting down human kingdoms and bringing a great shaking on the earth. Though I don't know what's going to happen in the time immediately before the return of Christ. There's going to be a new heaven, so of course there's going to be some kind of, resorting of the cosmos at that point. But I would start with at least interpreting this in the way that Isaiah would. Then in verse 30, that is a clear reference to Daniel chapter 7, which I think we could understand that as the ascension of Christ and claiming authority over the nations of the earth, even as it also will be relevant when Christ comes again in glory. And so I don't know in these verses at what point does it shift from the ascension of Christ and God asserting his authority over the earth versus when does it refer to the parousia. I don't know exactly where that line is, but because so much of this is Old Testament imagery, I want to at least start there and hold my eschatology open when it comes to those verses. Then it pulls us back to verse 32 through 35, and I think 34 is especially relevant. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until these things have happened. So Jesus is clearly saying to them, at least some substantial portion of this is going to happen within the lifespan of the listeners that Jesus is speaking to in this moment. Doesn't mean all of it, doesn't mean it doesn't have end times relevance, but I think it would be a mistake to interpret this entire passage as only an end times blueprint. And I would argue that probably the more detail in this passage is a historical event, even as it also anticipates the second coming of Christ at the end of history.
And to be fair to other viewpoints, I think you mentioned this last week, some people would interpret this generation to mean the age of the church. So there are different ways to read this. But I think what I hear you saying, Drew, is to at least start with the text and allow the text to give text to context, allow the text to give the context for interpreting Scripture. And you're making these connections to the book of Daniel, the book of Isaiah. You can look ahead to Revelation chapter 12, which continues to kind of fill out this narrative, and then on through the next 4 or 5 chapters in the book of Revelation, which we'll get to next week. But to maybe just another exhortation here to when we talk about things like the end times, there's a lot that's floating around out there in cyberspace and social media and so on and so forth. May we be vigilant to remain people of the text and allow the text to inform our understanding of the teachings on the end times.
Here's what I find is helpful in these passages is there are parts that are admittedly complicated and confusing. I have opinions, others have opinions, and godly men and women through history have had different opinions on these texts. However, what I believe to be are the most important elements are really not that confusing. Mm-hmm. And where we can fall into danger is we can spend all of our time debating what exactly is the abomination that causes desolation, rather than looking at the direct parables of Jesus that he's explicitly teaching his disciples, this is how you are supposed to live during this time up and until I return. And we'll get into those here in a second. And I think he's giving us insight into what this age is like. Wars, rumors of wars. There's this persistent threat of the love of many people growing cold. The gospel is being preached in all the nations. Like any way we slice it, these are things that shape our world, that mark our world. And as a Christian, we need to be prepared for these things because this is going to be what our journey entails. And there were certainly some unique challenges for that first century church, and especially the first century Jewish church, just as there's also some unique challenges for us. So I don't think we need to hyper-focus on how exactly we understand some of that I would view more as a reference to the first century temple. I think instead we can say there's, regardless of where you land there, the other stuff's crystal clear, and that's honestly where as Christians we should put our primary emphasis as far as response. I'm not saying all Scripture is God-breathed. Of course, we need to study all of it, but where do we put our primary energy is on what's most clear, not on what's most obscure.
Yeah, and maybe, again, just to speak to some of the angst that's out there, and again, we're not intending this series to be a response to global events, but we happen to coincide with some very significant global events, especially anytime you include the nation of Israel and the ongoing just tragedy that's unfolding in the Middle East. And, we've alluded to this in the past, but would just offer it again that every generation since the time of Jesus has had probably a claim on global events being such that they are heralding the coming of Christ, meaning there have been difficulties, significant difficulties in every generation since Jesus. And I would even argue, if you look just historically, not to minimize any of the challenges that are going on in our world today, but comparatively, we live in the wealthiest, healthiest, and safest generation. I'm not just talking about in America, but global aggregates, statistically and proportionally, even with the conflicts that rage around the world today, compared to what was going on globally in the 1930s or in the early 1800s or in the 15th century, 14th century with the plague in Europe killing a third of the population, or the conquests of Genghis Khan. And you could just go century by century, and the scale and the scope of what humans have lived through in terms of devastation and plagues and famines and war. So we're not unique. Now, that doesn't mean Jesus isn't returning in our lifetime. It doesn't mean he's not returning today. But I think we would be hard-pressed to align current events in such a way that we could make a solid connection to biblical prophecy and what's going on around us today, just based on some of the difficulties that we perceive.
Yeah, I think we could say, don't look to world events, look to Jesus. And that's probably just a good theological principle, is world events should not dictate our eschatology. Jesus and Scripture should dictate our eschatology. And when in doubt, focus more on him rather than obsess about what's going on in the world.
And this is where we'll turn here in a moment, even if you could make a solid claim that current world events are a sign heralding the soon coming of Christ, our response to that is not going to change. The response is not now, okay, insulate my life from pain. The command in Scripture is to all the more give my life away for the vulnerable, the marginalized, and so on, which we'll turn to in a moment. So even if these are the signs of the ends, the sign of the end times, our response should not change in terms of our obedience to Jesus and in terms of where you're going next year.
And that's great, where Jesus gets into these parables starting in Matthew 24, verse 36. This first one, I'm going to read the first few verses because I think it speaks to that. And as I read this, consider how this fits in our eschatological paradigms, because it does somewhat contradict, at least in my mind, I hate picking on Left Behind, but, kind of the Left Behind inspired eschatology. It says this: "No one knows the day or the hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and being given in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark, and none of them knew about what would happen until the flood came and took them away. This is how it's going to be at the coming, the parousia of the Son of Man." So what's the message here? The message here is, when Jesus returns, it will be unexpected and life will be continuing as normal. Now, as normal, I think, includes wars, rumors of wars, and all the other stuff. And so life continuing as normal would mean probably there are some people that are suffering tremendously when Christ returns, but others that are living in wealth and things are going great for them. And he's kind of saying the world is going to look the same, and I'm going to come, and it's going to surprise you. So what's the exhortation? Keep watch, because you don't know on what day your Lord will come. And that's your point, Mick. Regardless of when the Lord comes, we have a responsibility to keep watch. So as a Christian, Jesus is commanding me, I need to keep watch because Christ may come tomorrow. Keep watch doesn't mean watch the news. Keep watch means watch my own heart, my own soul, my own faithfulness. And am I going to be found faithful if he were to come in a way that surprised me? I woke up in the morning and thought I was going to live my daily life, and later on that day, I'm standing before his throne giving account for my life. The reality is that'll happen to me at some point, as it will all of us. But for whatever that last generation looks like, that's what he's saying. It's going to surprise you. So how am I going to find you when I show up?
Yeah, and keep watch could also maybe mean eager anticipation, like eager expectation. And remember, Steph went to Austin for some real estate classes a couple years ago, and she was coming back one afternoon, but we didn't know the exact hour of her arrival, and we'd tried to clean the house, and the kids wanted to, we were watching the Find My iPhone to see, exactly when, which we won't have a Find My iPhone to know exactly when Jesus was returning. But the point was the kids wanted to be ready they wanted to be outside, and we had a poster because she had passed a class, and we're eagerly anticipating her return. So when she came, we were ready to meet her, as opposed to had she come home and we barely acknowledged her return. We weren't eagerly anticipating. We weren't being watchful. And I think there's something of that sentiment in this verse of the heart posture of Jesus' followers that sometimes I think, would I be surprised if Jesus came back today? And the answer is yes. But to what degree? Like, would I just be so shocked? Oh my gosh, I thought this was real, but I'm actually kind of shocked that you really are real and you really are returning again. Or like, wow, I didn't think it would be today, but I was anticipating this day.
That's great.
I've been looking forward to this day. I am rejoicing in the return of Christ.
Yeah, I love that illustration. He shows up. Is it like, hooray, or is it, uh-oh?
Yeah.
I think that's what it's getting at here. Is that like, oh, I'm so shocked. This is the best day ever, or is it, oh man, I wasted my life? Mm-hmm. And that's a really sobering thought. And the end of that parable concludes, you must also be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Now, this is something that bugs me, not in the eschatological framework, but how some people apply it, is they take something like that and they're like, well, let's figure out the hour when we can expect Jesus to come. And his point is, I'm going to come when you don't expect me. So why are we trying to overcome what Jesus said and not do what he told us to do? It's like he didn't say, I'm going to come at an hour when you don't expect me, so watch the world events closely so you can know when I'm coming. That's not what he's saying here. He's saying, I'm going to come when you don't expect me, so you need to lead a faithful life so that when I do come, you're pleasantly surprised, not painfully surprised by my coming. Mm-hmm. Okay, second parable builds right off the first one. And this is the story of the master who sets a servant in charge of his house. He leaves, and then he comes back. And here's what it says. It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing what he told him to do when he returns. But, I'm jumping down. Suppose that the servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time. And then he begins to beat his fellow servants, to eat and drink with drunkards. And then the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect it, and in an hour when he is not aware of it. So this is that same message from the first parable is now being given, and this is the uh-oh version of that. Mm-hmm. What Jesus is saying, my return is going to be like, I'm putting you in charge of something, and I'm asking you to do it, and I'm asking you to be faithful, and I'm going to come back. And I love how it specifies here, it's both unexpected and a long time. So he's saying it's not going to be a time when you think I'm coming, and it's going to be longer than you anticipate. So when I show up, when I walk back through the door of the house, do I see you working diligently as I left you? Because if so, that's going to be a really awesome moment. But if I show up, and rather than you being the steward of my house, you have tried to become the head of my house, you are misusing my possessions, you are abusing the people I've given to you, you are not caring for my things. If I show up at that, and that's what I find, then it's going to be a real problem for you. And it's really the same thing from the first parable. You're not going to know what's going to happen. It's going to be a long time, but will you be faithful when I come?
And what I think I hear you saying there, Drew, is the rebuke for the servant is not, you did not accurately predict the time of my return. The rebuke there is your activity, the posture of your heart when I do return, right? So I think some people could read that and think like, well then, like you just said, I need to spend more time trying to interpret the signs so I can be ready. That's missing the point. It's missing the forest for the trees, that the emphasis there is on the activity and the posture of the heart of the individual.
Yeah, let's take Jesus' parable here. Let's say I am the servant, and I'm like, it doesn't, I don't have to be faithful because I'm going to figure out when the master is coming back. And then what we're going to do the night before he comes, we're going to power clean the house like we used to do in college before our parents came. We're going to power clean the house. We're going to get everything done. I'm going to say sorry to all the people that I ill-treated for the last however many years. And then he's going to show up and things are going to give the appearance of being good. That's not what Jesus wants us to do. Mm-hmm. He's not saying, can you predict when I'm coming and then get your act together for a few minutes right before I show up so that when I show up, you've faked it for a long time. Like, I think of people who've predicted the return of Christ, and theoretically at some point, somebody's going to predict it accurately just by sheer luck, But how terrible would it be to accurately predict the return of the Lord and not be faithful when the Lord comes? Like, I just feel like Jesus is telling us right here what he wants. Don't put your energy trying to predict when I'm going to come. Put your energy living like a disciple and caring for my people. That's what I want from you. Like and I said this last week, I'll say it again. My dream would be the Lord returns and it surprises me. It shocks me and he catches me being faithful. That would be, I think that should be every Christian's dream, is that's how he finds us. And that takes a different type of faithfulness than kind of this very speculative, tantalizing, guessing about when the Lord's going to return, where we live really radically for a short season because, oh yeah, he's coming back soon, but we're not actually ready to live a long life of faithfulness, whether he comes back in our lifetime or it's many, many generations from now.
That's good. That's good. So that pivots to Matthew 25.
So Matthew 25, we have the parable of the 10 virgins. And in this story, it's familiar to many of us. You have, it's a metaphor of a bride and bridegroom, and it's kind of this wedding illustration where you have the groom shows up, and he's being welcomed in, and you have kind of this wedding party. And what happens in this story is that they have lamps, and the lamps have oil, but then this groom is taking a really long time, and as he returns, half of these people waiting for him, they discovered they did not have enough oil, and so they have to leave, and they're not present when he comes, and so they're left on the outside looking in because he came later than they anticipated, so they weren't ready for him. These 5 virgins did have the oil, so when he shows up, they're ready for him, and they're welcomed into the house. Okay, so that's the basics of this story. I want to highlight a couple things, though. First, it says this, that the bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and all fell asleep. So what's the significance of this? First, it's going to be a long time. So if the first 2 parables are Jesus is going to come and we're not going to anticipate his coming, or at least it will be unexpected. We can anticipate emotionally in our hearts, but we will not expect him at the hour in which he arrives. That's the theme of that one. In this story, and I think we'll see it in the next one as well, the accent is on that it's going to be a long time. And so it's specified, this is going to be a long wait. And you'll notice in this story, all 10 people are asleep. And so none of them were on the wall and noticed his coming. They were all surprised by his coming. And so I think that's another significant factor in this, is nobody in this story is rebuked for not being awake or knowing, and not awake in a moral sense, but awake in a sense of they knew when he was going to come. There's no rebuke given for the fact that it was a long time and it came later than they anticipated. That's not the problem here. The problem here is that half of the people were not prepared for it being a long wait. And I think this is really critical. And even last week, when we talked about this healthy tension we hold of a Maranatha cry in our heart, come Lord Jesus, this belief and understanding that we live in light of the Lord's coming, and that's what drives us and motivates us in the sense that our whole life is the Lord's and we live for him, together with the fact that everything I see in Scripture is this exhortation to be prepared for a long faithfulness. Mm-hmm. So he's not saying live radically and flame out. He's saying live faithfully the entirety of your life, and then prepare the next generation to live faithfully, and then prepare the next generation to live faithfully. And we used that metaphor last week of planting trees, of doing the long, slow work so that the entirety of our lives are faithful and not just a short season.
And it's interesting to contrast with the first part of Matthew 24, where the language was, hey, this is going to happen in your lifetime. Hey, be prepared for this. Hey, this is going to be difficult. And even the transition there when it starts talking about the sun and the moon falling, I can't remember which verse that is, but it says immediately after these things. And then all of a sudden this transition, oh, and by the way, the coming of the Son of Man is going to take a really long time.
It's just going to be long. And I think the message to us, now I've heard a lot of teaching that I don't think is incorrect, but looking at oil in these passages, talking a lot about different forms of prayer or intimacy with the Lord. And I think that very well could be the case of this. If I'm going to just take the immediate context, I think what it's saying is be prepared for a long time. And that feels really basic, and so that does include my spiritual life, but I think it's holistic of be ready for this to be a very long journey, And so that way we are building for the sake of a very prolonged period of faithfulness so that the Lord finds us ready when he comes, however long that may be. From our vantage point, being prepared for a long time is not just the span of our lifetimes. And I think that's critical for us to get here, but it's actually generational. My duty and my preparation is I'm preparing generations to be prepared. And so lifetimes upon lifetimes upon lifetimes of people that are storing up oil so they're prepared for the coming of the Lord, so that whenever he comes, whatever generation he returns, he finds faithful people waiting for him.
That's good.
Now that passage ends with a similar exhortation, therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour. Again, it's referencing the Lord comes when you don't expect him. The context of this story is a long time, but the concluding exhortation is a reminder it will be unexpected, so we have to be faithful. The fourth parable is similar to the one we just read, but it's a different metaphor that's used. This is one of a master who goes away for a long time, which is similar to one we've already talked about. And in this story, what he does is he distributes his wealth to his servants. So, think back in those days, like a long journey could be years. And what he's doing is he's essentially saying, I want you to invest my money so that when I come back, my money hasn't just been sitting idly this entire time. It'd be the equivalent of us, I have money, I'm going to put it into some kind of stocks because I want it to yield an investment so that a few years from now, it's not just the same amount, but it's yielded some kind of a return. So that's the different cultural context, but that's the idea of this. And in this case, there's not a stockbroker, there's not a bank. He's distributing his wealth to his household servants, not for their personal use, but so that they can steward his wealth so that it can yield a return so that by the time he comes back, there's more of it. So you have one person's given 5, one person's given 2 or 3, and the other person is given 1. Okay, so in these stories, you see 3 responses. The person with 5, they take the money, they put it to work, and they make a good return on that investment. The person who's given 2 does the same thing. But the servant that's given 1, what they do is they take the money, the gold that they were given, and they bury it out of fear because they don't want the responsibility of stewarding what the master has given to them. And so they're just content to let it sit there. And so when the master comes back, they've actually done nothing with what the master has given them. They haven't lost it, but they haven't done anything with it. And so they just hand it back to him. So in that sense, they're surprised. But in this story, the surprise is like, wow, you actually didn't do anything what was given to you. And so here is the response, and here's what happens. Verse 19, after a long time, that theme again, after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The master honors and blesses the ones who did the work, but there is a deep punishment, or I don't even know how to say it,
Certainly a rebuke.
A rebuke for the one who did nothing. Mm-hmm. So what's the message to us, the relevance for the end times teaching? God has given us different gifts. He's given us grace. He's given us a calling, or all types of things that we are meant to steward, and we're meant to take what he's given us and invest it in the kingdom for his purposes. Now, at some point, we are going to be called to account for what he's been given. And I think it's important in this verse, what matters is not the number. The person who was given 5 and the person who was given 2 and the person who was given 1, there's no difference in value in the sense of the moral ramifications for those people. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story is, were you faithful with what you were given? Mm-hmm. And were you prepared for the long journey of the master so that you took the time to do what was right with it? And I think this is the relevance for us. I mentioned last week a danger of an overly imminent eschatology. The danger of that, in my mind, is we become the servant who got the 1 bag of gold or the 1 talent. What we can do is like, well, he's returning soon anyway. I don't want to go invest it in the bank because I don't know when he's going to get back. I'm just going to bury it. Then what we realize is we didn't actually live faithfully with what God has given to us. Mm-hmm. That's a small minority of people. Most Christians don't live like that. I think the larger, broader danger is that we take what's been given and we invest it in ourselves. So we're not actually investing it for the sake of God, but we take what's been given to us as though it was ours, and we're not stewards of what he gave us for his own purposes. There's a lot of different dangers that we can read in this passage, and it's a very familiar parable, but it is worth noting that it's set in the context of eschatology. It's set in the context of the master's going to be away a long time. He's given us something to do, and we're not going to know when he comes back, we're not going to know the signs of his return. We will know when he comes back, but it's going to be surprising, and it's going to be long. So were we faithful during that time so that when he returned, he found that we had invested what he'd given us properly.
And not just money, but the talents could represent really just everything that's stewarded to us. So relationships, resources, gifts, opportunities. And I think if you have an overly imminent eschatology, why would I spend 10 years going to school to get a PhD in chemistry or, something like that? I should just be in northern India sharing the gospel with unreached peoples. And I know this is a longer conversation from other times. We need people who are reaching the unreached. But the overly imminent eschatology could say there's no room for, in my eschatology, there's no room for developing a trade, starting a business, and so on and so forth. But within a kingdom perspective, that includes this kind of this long time in coming, where we're passing on the oracles of the faith generation to generation to generation, and my work is somehow a manifestation of the generosity of God in his common grace to distribute his provision to all people. Then it matters. It matters what I do with the stewardship of what he has put before me.
Yeah, even you mentioned missions. Some of the early Pentecostal missionaries who had this really strong view of imminent eschatology didn't learn the language, because they're like, oh, we'll just go, we speak in tongues, we'll figure it out, And so I think for those called to missions, this is, am I willing to take the time to learn the language? Am I willing to take the time to understand the culture? Are we willing to take the time to translate the scripture so that there's an enduring testimony? Are we establishing churches that will have generational impact, that know how to develop the next generation? And even in our church community, there's a lot of emphasis on what does it actually mean to be multi-generational? So how do we, and I think that's such a right way of thinking. And it's, you even go back into Hebrew scriptures, so much of it is on generational. Is one generation preparing the next? That is the long work of the kingdom, not the short work of the kingdom. And as any parent knows, it takes so much time to train up a generation. And I love the examples you gave, and whether that's vocational ministry, the way that we engage mission, or church leadership, or whether that is business, and in a business, like how are you understanding your business? Is it long-term witness for the kingdom, not just long-term profit maximization, but long-term witness? And when I say witness, I mean holistic, the way that you treat people, the way that business operates, the way that, all of it. Art, you mentioned scholarship. I mean, there's so many areas of life that I think this applies to. Are we taking what's been given us and stewarding it so that it yields a consistent return is the message of the kingdom? And yes, I should also be motivated that the Lord may return tomorrow. So I think that frames my way of thinking. So I am going to be bold with my faith. I am going to take risky steps of faith, whatever the case may be, but I'm doing so with the default commitment of I'm preparing for the long haul, not just viewing my life as a short-term mission trip where I do 3 weeks of intensity, but then I eventually tap out because I wasn't ready for long-term faithfulness. And I think that's the key message, and especially if you're on the younger end, is live wholeheartedly for the Lord. Take the risky step of faith, but you got to also be ready that this is a life of long-term faithfulness. Don't just think through, what does 25 or 28 or 30 look like? Think through living at age 70, what does it mean for you to be a wholehearted, faithful disciple of Jesus in every facet of your life? That is the mindset I believe the Lord calls us to. And then how are you taking the things he's given you, the relationships, the gifting, the money, the education, and how are you stewarding that for Christ's kingdom holistically in every aspect of your life? And if you live like that, a holistic sense of witness where everything is the Lord's, your life is about his purposes, you're alive in him, you're serving his people, etc., and you're investing in the next generation, then when the master comes back, man, that's where you get the well done and good and faithful servant. But for those of us who we take those things and we squander them on ourselves, we use them for our own purposes, that's exactly what Jesus is saying is what we don't want to be found at when he returns.
Yeah, or stretch it out even further, 200 years, not just our lifetime, but 7 generations. How can I live in such a way that'll set up the next 6 generations to thrive in God? All right, so the last 16 verses kind of adds a little bit of a nuance to this conversation in terms of, we mentioned before that the purpose of thinking about the end times is not to insulate so I can protect my own well-being, but here we see that a key posture is caring for the poor and the marginalized. So to take us.
So this is an intense passage because this whole kind of section concludes with Jesus talking about the sheep and the goats, and it's saying at the end of time, after the return of the Lord, So this is not the signs of his coming, but this is post his return. He's going to look at his people and separate the sheep and the goats. And how he defines that, it's using a metaphor from a shepherd. And he's essentially saying one half is, using the shepherd metaphor is being slaughtered. The other half is, they're the flock of sheep. That's the idea that's driving the imagery of this passage. But he defines them for us. On the one side are those who cared for the poor. And on the other side are those who didn't, who gave lip service to God, but they didn't actually do the work of God. And I think this is a very sobering passage for us of what am I doing to care for the poor? Now, I can balance by saying we can look at our soteriology and what does it mean to be saved, and we're saved by grace through faith and the assurance that we have in Christ, and the rest of the testimony of Scripture. However, I think I also need to read Matthew 25 on its own merits, which is not giving me that assurance. And this is complex, so we got to hang with the thought. I'm not saying that we're not assured of our salvation. I'm not saying that somebody is condemned to hell, because they didn't meet a certain financial threshold for giving to the poor. Obviously, that's not what this is meaning. But I think the point of it is the parable is meant to make us uncomfortable. And so, yes, we interpret it within our larger soteriology, but if reading this does not make you uncomfortable, then you probably haven't read it right. It is intended to provoke discomfort inside of us because what's Jesus trying to say? It goes back to the parable of the talents. It's tied to this one. I want to see that you invested rightly. And by the way, the type of investment I'm looking for is, did you care for the poor? Did you care for the marginalized? Or, I'm stretching slightly, or did you use wealth and all the things that have been given to you for your own pleasure and purposes? Or did you invest it into those who need it? And I don't know how often I've heard this Matthew 25 incorporated into eschatological teaching, but it's right here in the text, and it's pretty clear that it needs to fit in that category. Jesus is telling us, these are the types of things I am looking for. So let's wrap this up. I think there are three major themes from these parables that I would say are eschatological teaching from Matthew 24 and 25. The first is that Jesus is going to return when we don't expect him. So the ramification of that is we live holistic, faithful lives with the reality that he could come back tomorrow. And that goes back to the positive side of that imminent eschatology. I don't know when I'm going to meet the Lord. I'm not going to know when I meet the Lord. So therefore, it's incumbent on me, can I be found faithful whenever he comes? So that if he comes tomorrow, if he comes 30 years from now, or if he comes 500 years from now, any way you slice it, I was found faithful with my life. That's the call, I believe, for all Christians. Second, am I prepared for that to be a long time? Am I being diligent with what God has given me? Am I taking the time to be ready so that my life can be that long-term faithfulness where I'm stewarding every facet of my life, my witness, and calling? Then thirdly, does that involve reflection of caring for the poor and being about the work of the kingdom, or did I get caught up in the things of this world and actually miss out on what God is wanting to do? So maybe summarizing this teaching today, first part of Matthew 24 definitely has some historical context, also has some end times, or eschatological, parousia, that word's actually used 4 times, relevance. Where those lines are is going to be a bit complicated, though I think there are some clear things we can draw from it. But regardless of how you interpret those first 31 or 36 verses, you then have to grapple with these 5 parables that teach you what it means to live in this time up and until the return of the Lord. And I think if we could put the emphasis on these parables, that's probably the most important thing, and then that'll help us to understand the rest of Christian eschatological teaching.
Great stuff. And if you hung in to the end of this episode, way to go. Hopefully this was helpful content and a reflection for the times that we find ourselves in. This was week 2 of an exploration of eschatology, and we'll pick it up again next week as we look at the book of Revelation. Thanks as always for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.